Go ahead and have your Bibles open to Psalm 40 this evening. Psalm 40. So Austin makes a wisecrack about it. Won't be very long if there's some connection between the title of that song and our lesson this evening. But I can assure you, the length of our lesson is determined by the length of Psalm 40 tonight. It won't be any longer than Psalm 40, which is a really great psalm. Let's start off reading here the entire psalm, and we'll go back and we'll just make a few points along the way, make some applications. Not every single verse, to be sure, but just some main points as we go through this psalm. So let's go ahead and read Psalm 40 now, beginning in verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord, and He inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay. He set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. And He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and will trust in the Lord. Verse 4. How blessed is the man who has made the Lord his trust, and has not turned to the proud, nor to those who lapse into falsehood. Many, O Lord my God, are the wonders which Thou hast done, and Thy thoughts toward us. There is none to compare with Thee. If I would declare and speak of them, they would be too numerous to count. Verse 6. Sacrifice and meal offering Thou hast not desired. My ears Thou hast opened. Burnt offering and sin offering Thou hast not required. Then I said, Behold, I come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do Thy will, O my God. Thy law is within my heart. Verse 9. I have proclaimed glad tidings of righteousness in the great congregation. Behold, I will not restrain my lips. O Lord, Thou knowest. I have not hidden Thy righteousness within my heart. I have spoken of Thy faithfulness and Thy salvation. I have not concealed Thy loving kindness and Thy truth from the great congregation. Verse 11. Thou, O Lord, wilt not withhold Thy compassion from me. Thy loving kindness and Thy truth will continually preserve me. For evils beyond number have surrounded me. My iniquities have overtaken me so that I am not able to see it. They are more numerous than the hairs of my head, and my heart, oh my heart, has failed me. Verse 13. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. Make haste, O Lord, to help me. Let those be ashamed and humiliated together who seek my life to destroy it. Let those be turned back and dishonored who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, Aha! Aha! Let all who seek Thee rejoice and be glad in Thee. Let those who love Thy salvation say continually, The Lord be magnified. Since I am afflicted and needy, let the Lord be mindful of me. Thou art my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. Well, let's look at verses 1 through 3 a little bit closer and make a few applications here. God sustains His servant is the subtitle here. It's a psalm of David. I love how he says, I waited patiently for the Lord. Sometimes you have to be patient with God. God is not a vending machine, is typically what we will say about that. When we say our prayers, when we ask Him for something, even if we plead for something, sometimes the answer is either no, altogether, or the answer takes a little while to become obvious and apparent to us. We need to remember that patience is one of the great virtues. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 and verse 22. Patience is a key part of love in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4. By patience we inherit our promises in Hebrews chapter 6 verses 12 through 15. Patience reminds me not to listen to Satan's lies when the promises of God seem to be taking a little bit longer than I think that they should, that I believe that they should. Isn't it a relief to know that waiting for the Lord is a normal thing, though? Even a man like David is saying, I waited patiently for the Lord. This is a guy who was after God's own heart. He was very close with God. You read any psalm that David wrote, and it's apparent that he was very, very intimate with God, and that God cared about him and loved him very deeply. And yet even a man like David said, I waited patiently. Waiting is a normal thing. And sometimes it is in the process of waiting that we learn most what it means to trust and depend on God. If God just gave us everything that we wanted right away, would we really learn how to be patient about anything? That's one of the things that's, I think, been hardest to teach our son Sterling, is to be patient, to just wait that couple of minutes that it takes us to get something for him, to prepare something for him. It's very easy, and I think it's the default mode for all of us, whether Sterling's age or anybody else, it's the default mode to say, give it to me now. And here's David with a lot of maturity and a lot of wisdom saying, I waited patiently for the Lord. And why does he wait so patiently? Because precedent has always shown that God comes through. He brought me out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, he says, and he set my feet on solid ground. He put me somewhere that he knew, and I know my footsteps can actually take me somewhere. Now, what is the pit? Let's talk about the pit for a minute. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction. Sometimes the pits that we face are conditions that are beyond our control. We lose a job. We get a bad diagnosis. We lose a loved one to death or illness. We lose a friend because of a poor choice that he or she made. And we take a stand on moral grounds that we can't be around evil companionship. There's a lot of pits that we face that we bring on ourselves as well. There's pits of self-pity. We feel sorry for ourselves, and we want everybody around us to feel sorry for us as well. There's pits of bitterness where we assume the worst about everybody around us. There's pits where we believe everybody is out to get us. We look with suspicion at everybody around us. But he says here that God brought me out of the pit of destruction. A couple of lessons here from a book called Get Out of That Pit by Beth Moore. The author gives some suggestions on how to escape the pit of destruction here in Psalm 40. She says that there are no lost causes, so we need to never see ourselves as any kind of a lost cause. She writes, you don't have to stay in the pit, even if you've been there for your whole life. Never see yourself as too far gone. Never see yourself as too bitter, too angry, too jaded to ever get yourself out of the pit of destruction. She says, frequent pit visiting also has a way of turning into pit living. That if you find yourself constantly going to the pit of destruction, if you find yourself frequenting despair and frustration and anxiety and depression, you might just find yourself staying there all the time. She says the earlier we enter the pit or the longer we stay there, the more the pit tends to feel like home. We start hanging our pictures on the wall, tidying up the place, and making ourselves comfortable with pit living. We invite others to visit us in the pit, and sometimes they feel sufficiently enough at home to unpack their bags as well. The final point that she makes about getting out of the pit is, don't let anybody, particularly somebody with a twisted doctrine of grace, talk you into thinking that you can't be liberated from willful sin and blatant rebellion just because he or she hasn't been able to. And I would look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, as evidence enough that there is no pit that you're facing that God cannot help you get out of. When you read in verses 9 and 10 of 1 Corinthians 6, there's some pretty nasty things in there, isn't there? There's lying and drunkenness and adultery, and even homosexuality is mentioned there. And verse 11 says, and such were some of you. What does it say? Such were, past tense, some of you. We've talked a lot about necessary inferences. We crack some jokes every now and then about it, but there's an inference in there that is necessary. The phrase that such were some of you necessarily infers that you are no longer that now. That you were drunkards, you were adulterers, you were liars, and you are not anymore. There is no pit that you're facing that God cannot help you get out of. But let's move a little bit further in the psalm and look again at verses 4 and 5. There's some points I want to make here out of verses 4 and 5. That how blessed is the man who's made the Lord his trust. That's very reminiscent of Psalm 1, isn't it? In Psalm 1, we're presented with two kinds of people. Those who put their trust and their faith in God, and those who put their trust and their faith in mankind. And there's a very different outcome for each of those. I recommend reading Psalm 1 if you want a little bit more information about that one as well. And when I read in verses 4 and 5, the thing that kind of jumps out at me is that David was a man like us who was probably burned by others in the past. You think about in David's life all the people who had disappointed him. He was disappointed by his brothers when they insulted him when he came to the battlefield. They assumed he was just there to see some action. He wasn't there for that purpose. And I think that his brothers really thought little of him. He was disappointed by his brothers. He was disappointed by his king, Saul, the very king that he said that he would always serve. God's anointed, he said. That same Saul tried to pin him to a wall with a spear twice, and he hunted him down like a common criminal. He was disappointed by even his own wife, Michal. Michal chides him for his zeal and excitement at the Ark of the Covenant returning to its home. She says, you're acting like a fool by being so excited about it and dancing around like a commoner. He was disappointed by that as well. There were a lot of people that seemed to disappoint David. His own kids disappointed him. You read about some of the kids that David produced. His sons, that is a laundry list of bad people. And then we read here in Psalm 40. The only one who never disappointed him was God. How blessed is the man who has made the Lord his trust and has not turned to the proud, nor to those who lapse into falsehood. There's a lot of things that you've done for me, he says. Many are your wonders. And I like this phrase also, and thy thoughts toward us. You think about that. Thy thoughts toward us. That God actually spends his time thinking about us. I think that's a very humbling thought. That God would take any of his time that I swear could just be better spent worrying about bigger things, more important people, more valuable people to his kingdom. And yet God takes his time and he thinks about me. He thinks about me. You think about your own kids like all the time? You worry about your kids? You worry about what kind of choices they're going to make, what kind of people they're going to turn out to be? Do you think about what kind of career path they're going to take, what kind of schooling they're going to pursue? Do you think about a boyfriend or a girlfriend that they talk about when they come home from school? Do you stay up late at night thinking about your kids? And I think that's a little bit of what Psalm 40 is talking about here. That many are his thoughts toward us, that God actually thinks about you and I. Of all the people in the world, of all the things that God could be thinking about, he seems to have time to care about little old worthless me. Worthless in my own estimation, but apparently worth something in his. One writer put it really well. She says, his thoughts toward us. When I was a parent of young children, I thought I knew what biblical parenting was. Feed them, shelter them, teach them, discipline them. Years later, I realized I missed one or two things about parenting. One of them was delight in them, as God delights in us. And the other one was think thoughts toward them. Stay up nights trying to figure out creative ways to build them up, to bless them, to encourage them, to help them in their weakness, to make them all that they can be. God has these thoughts toward you. Isn't that wonderful? Did you worry that your little problems were unimportant and that God had other fish to fry? Just as we try to find ways of stimulating our children and helping them to become the most mature and blessed individuals that they can be, I think God is also thinking about, what can I do to help you become the best person you can be? What can I do for Ryan Goodwin to make him the best preacher, the best husband, the best father, the best friend to others that he can possibly be? What can I do to help support him in that work? Skip on down to verse 10. There's a point I want to make here about the great congregation, because there's several times here where he talks about the great congregation. Read again in verse 10. I have not hidden thy righteousness within my heart. I have spoken of thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. To me, what this is saying is we all face that time where we have the choice to either speak up or not speak up. Stand up for something or give in to the world around you. And David is saying with a great deal of boldness, I have chosen to speak of your greatness and your righteousness before the great congregation. Now, maybe the great congregation is speaking of the Israelites themselves, your people, or those who have gathered in your sanctuary to worship you. But it could be that the great congregation is just speaking of all mankind. I tend to think that's what it's more talking about, because of the boldness that's required to talk to worldly people, to people who are not like you. A couple of the songs, actually, that Austin led really led nicely into this particular point. What have you done lately to speak up before the great congregation of the wondrous deeds of the Lord? It's really easy to back down, to not say something. It takes a great deal of boldness to stand up for what is right when you know that it is right in particular. There is a great congregation of people out there. There is a great congregation of people who are lost. There is a great congregation of people who are dying in their sins. But sometimes we get so comfortable because of our own salvation. We're so happy that we are saved personally that we don't take the time to care about those who are not. It reminds me of Job 12 and verse 5. Notice what it says in Job 12 and verse 5. In the thought of one who is at ease, there is contempt for misfortune. When you know that you're saved and you have nothing to worry about spiritually, maybe you don't have as much sympathy, as much compassion for those who are not saved as you should. In the thought of one who is at ease, there is contempt for misfortune. Verse 11 says, Thou, O Lord, wilt not withhold thy compassion from me. Thy loving kindness and thy truth will continually preserve me. First of all, I love the word loving kindness. I don't speak German, but there's something I really like about the German language. To me, it feels like Germans just stuff as many words together as they can to make single words. You know, they just take all different words, and when they want to say something, they just take a bunch of parts of different words and just stuff them together. You know what the word in German is for a seat on a train? It's a Sitzenplatz. Well, it's like that. That's the idea of loving kindness. You know, if loving is not enough, and if kindness is not enough, put those two together, and you've got yourself a really awesome compound word. Loving kindness. It is exactly what it says it is. It is loving kindness. We need more words like that, don't we? We wouldn't talk about loving kindness anymore. And yet when it comes to the way that God loves us and the way that God shows His kindness to us, you can't do anything but put a bunch of really cool words together to describe it. Thou, O Lord, wilt not withhold, he says. Observe the way that David speaks to God. He thanks Him in advance for what God is going to do for him. Sometimes I can say that my prayers usually involve more pleases than thanks. Please don't withhold your compassion from me. Please preserve me with loving kindness and truth. That's how we often phrase our prayers. But David prays with such confidence, as if there is no doubt about the outcome of his petitions. You will not withhold it, God. I know you well enough that I can say you will not withhold your compassion, and you will continually preserve me. That's not being arrogant. That's not being presumptuous. All David is doing is looking at what God has always done for him and assuming that that will continue until told otherwise. If God has always loved us, why would he stop? If God has always preserved us spiritually, why would he no longer do that? If God has always forgiven us when we come to him with a contrite heart, why should we assume that that would ever end? When I confess my sins before the Lord, I know and am completely confident that he will forgive me. Why? Because he promised that he would. And because he always has. I guess the question then becomes, do you pray with that kind of boldness or that kind of confidence? Do our prayers express doubts and complaints? Or do they express gratitude in confidence that he is the great deliverer? Skip on down to verses 13 through 15 now. I want to notice a couple things here about 13 through 15. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. Make haste, O Lord, to help me. Now, earlier in the psalm, he was saying, I waited patiently for the Lord. And now he's saying, make haste, O Lord, to help me. Is there an incongruity there? Is there a problem there that at one point he's saying, oh yeah, I'll wait patiently for God. But now he's saying, well, hurry things up. Hurry it up. Now, I don't think there's an incongruity at all. I think David is saying, make haste. I want this to happen now. Always with the qualifier in the back of his mind that if you do not make haste, I will trust you nevertheless. Sometimes God doesn't make haste. Sometimes he does not make haste to deliver us from certain things. Sometimes God leaves us to encounter various trials for a great long time in life. And I think that like David, we have to be willing to be patient. We want him to make haste. We plead with him and ask him to make haste to deliver us. But when he doesn't, we have to resolutely trust him and say in our prayers, I know that this is for a reason. I know that this is for a purpose. Another writer said, I'm glad to learn from this psalm that it's important to be willing to wait patiently for God's answers, but also that I may be bold enough to ask the Lord to make haste. The psalmist, she writes, has waited patiently in past troubles and has found that God always comes through. If God can do it once, then God can do it twice, and 1,000 times after that. And it is the memory of past deliverances that help us to hang in there with our present afflictions. But we can never have, and I like this, we can never have those empowering memories unless we begin now to walk in faith in present troubles. I like the way she puts that. Think about the times in your life that have been most formative. The times in your life that have changed you the most, that have made you the man or the woman that you are now. Think about those times. If you had not faced the trial, would you ever be who you are now? I love Job. And I know I've mentioned Job a few times in the last couple months, but that's because he's such a great example. Job was already a great man in Job chapter 1. He was the greatest of all the men of the East. He was, I think, relative to humanity's standards, he was a perfect individual, so says the Scripture. So even a perfect man who was the greatest of his generation still had something to learn. Would he have ever come to the same conclusion at the end of the book if he had not experienced the 40 chapters in between? Would he have ever learned the lesson of the last chapter of Job if the previous 40 had not happened? Would he have learned what he did, grown as a man as he did, become the mature individual that he was at the end of the book? He was already a good man, there's no doubt about that, but there was still something that he needed to learn as an individual. And that lesson could only be learned because of what he experienced in that book. I will never have those empowering memories. I will never look back on any kind of formative experiences if I don't have the patience to endure those formative experiences as they're happening. If you don't have the fortitude to sit through them, you'll never look back 10 or 20 years from now and say, it was all worth it. No, no. You don't get that reward. You don't get it. Nobody is allowed to have the treasure of hindsight if you didn't have the patience to sit through it. You don't get that. No, you're not allowed to. Nobody gets to sit back and say it was all worth it if you didn't endure it while it was happening. You don't get that. That is a treasure you'll never experience. It's a reward you'll never possess. Now we go into this phrase here in verse 15. Those who say to me, aha, aha. It's almost like Psalm 40 was written for me to read it, wasn't it? There's always going to be people out there who are watching you and waiting for you to trip up and fail. There's always going to be people watching your life, your Christian life, and the church is full of hypocrites, they'll say. And they're just waiting there, waiting for you to prove every theory they've ever had about hypocritical Christians. And when it does happen, when the Christian does fail, gotcha, they'll say. Gotcha! The Pharisees set up this whole thing in John chapter 8, didn't they? Just so they could catch Jesus in a lie. When they brought the woman caught in adultery to him, the whole purpose behind that was a gotcha moment. That was the whole reason they did it. They set before him in John chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, a woman caught in adultery, just so they could sit and see what he would say. So that when he tripped up, they could say, aha! Aha! They wanted to see what he would do when they saw his disciples eating grains in a field in the Gospel of Matthew, just so they could say, aha! to him. When they saw him healing a man on the Sabbath day, they jumped in and said, gotcha now, Jesus! There's always going to be people in this world waiting for you to mess up. Jesus was very well acquainted with the aha game. One would think that the devil would be tired of this game, though, since he's failed at catching God for so many ages. And yet we perpetuate the problem by treating each other the same way, don't we? As if it's not bad enough that there's worldly people waiting to yell aha at us. Don't Christians do the same thing to each other? We wait for a preacher or an elder to fail so we can yell out aha. We wait for our spouses to fail so we can one-up them. Aha! Our kids wait for our parents to fail so they can say aha. We wait for somebody to fail who we're jealous of or envious of, or somebody that we just don't like. And we're always ready, quick as a six-shooter, to yell out, gotcha, when they fail. They will be humiliated, though. They will be humiliated. And I think David has enough trust in God that even though there's people out there who are going to cry out, aha, aha, David knows those are the people who will be humiliated most of all. That's why he says, as we bring our lesson to a close, let all who seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee. Let those who love thy salvation say continually, the Lord be magnified. Wouldn't it be great if we said things like that to each other? We don't talk like that, do we? We say, hey, have a good week. Have a good day at work tomorrow. Now, I'm not saying be nerdy about it or be goofy or anything, but why don't we splash these sorts of things into our language every now and then? Why don't we say to each other, the Lord be magnified? Instead of saying goodbye, say the Lord be magnified. I was like, at the end of the book of 1 Corinthians, when you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, look at a little word he says in verse 22. If anyone does not love the Lord, let him be accursed. And he says in verse 22, Maranatha. You know what Maranatha means? It says, Lord, come quickly. That's just a buzzword to them. A good one, I mean. They ended their phrases saying, Maranatha. Hey, Brian, have a good week. Maranatha, man. The Lord come quickly. In judgment is really what he means there by Maranatha. But the Lord come quickly. Let those who love thy salvation say continually, the Lord be magnified. Since I am afflicted and needy, let the Lord be mindful of me. And he will be, because he cares and because he knows. Thou art my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, O my God. Now we have to remember something about the delaying of God. What might seem to us to be a delay on God's part might be very intentional. So I think we have to be really careful not to raise our fists into the heavens and say, why, God? Why is this happening to me right now? Why aren't you delivering me? Why aren't you taking care of me? God might not be delaying at all. It is in his time, for his own purposes, that all things come to pass in this life. And he has enough perspective to know that time really doesn't matter a whole lot. You remember when Peter the Apostle said that to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is but a day. So what might seem to you to be a delay on God's part might not be any delay at all. Let's trust that even when God doesn't answer our prayers right away, that he's not just sitting on his hands, that he's not just being lazy or forgetful. God's answering machine is never going to get so full that your prayers end up falling between the cracks and neglected. So we say, do not delay, O God. Deliver me from all of my trials. And he will. Now, if you're not a Christian here this evening, you really need to be. It is time to make the commitment to the one and only Savior. He says in John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And you go through Christ in baptism. We are baptized, each one of us, into the body of Christ. And in baptism, we are clothed in Christ. Baptism puts us into salvation. So if you need to become a Christian this evening, now is the time to respond to the invitation. Whatever needs you might have, please come forward as we stand and sing.